President Trump says that U.S. officials are on their way to Russia to discuss proposals backed by Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire. The Kremlin released this video of President Putin, which it said was him visiting the Russian border region of UKK. For the first time since Ukraine seized territory there last summer, he expressed hope that the region would soon be, in his words, completely liberated. Officials say that he'd been told the operation to drive Ukrainian forces from the region is in its final stages, while the White House has confirmed that President Trump's top mediator Steve Witkoff is heading to Moscow this week for discussions. Mr. Trump's spokeswoman said that we urge the Russians to sign on to this plan. This is the closest we have been to peace in this war. Well, all this comes after Ukraine agreed to a 30-day peace proposal. Ceasefire deal proposed by the U.S. during talks this week in Saudi Arabia. Mr. Trump says that the ball is now in Russia's court, indicating that he's heard positive messages from the Russian president. His top diplomat Marco Rubio said it would be unfortunate if Moscow rejected the proposal. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Rubio in just a moment. But first, Britain's Defense Secretary John Healey has urged President Putin to accept the ceasefire proposal, and I say to President Putin, over to you. Now you said you want to talk, prove it, accept the ceasefire, start negotiations, and end the war, and make no mistake. The pressure is now on Putin. We all eagerly await and the Russian response, and urge them strongly to consider ending all hostilities, so people will stop dying, so bullets will stop flying, and so a process can begin to find a permanent peace, and we'll see what. The response is, if their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If the response is no, it would be highly unfortunate, and then it make their intentions clear. Well, Marco Rubio is to hold talks with G7 foreign ministers in Canada. Our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is traveling with him. He sent us this update. Well, we got a few things clarified by the Secretary of State as he spoke to us on the way here to Canada. I think the first was really about the next steps in this joint. Now, American and Ukrainian call for an immediate ceasefire and about contacts with the Russians. You know, they said the ball is now in the Russians' court. He said that there was due to be contact with Moscow today. Now, he wouldn't clarify exactly what or at what level that would take place. But it also gave us a sense, I think, of the urgency with which the Trump administration wants to do all of this. He said this was about how they wanted the world to look within days. In terms of using diplomacy now, I think that will enhance some of the sense of criticism they've been around this, that the idea of trying to rush a truce will embolden the invading power. But the Americans say this is about using diplomacy rather than fighting. And I asked Mr. Rubio about what is a pretty lukewarm reference in the joint statement to the role of the Europeans in this process as he meets G7 lead G7 foreign ministers here. And I asked about European peacekeepers. Now, he wouldn't commit on that, saying instead that there were a number of different options for creating deterrence on the ground. Tom Bateman there, just a line coming from the AFP news agency, which is quoting the Kremlin saying that U.S. negotiators are flying to Russia for Ukraine talk. So our understanding is this is the Kremlin saying that U.S. negotiators are flying to Russia for Ukraine talks. A lot to discuss. Let's cross over live to Kyiv because our diplomatic correspondent James Landale joins us. James, good to see you. So a lot of different angles coming together today. But just bring us up today where we are with this potential ceasefire proposal. Well, it's very straightforward, really. We know that the Ukrainians have agreed to this U.S. proposal for a month-long interim immediate ceasefire. They have signed up to that. In principle. So now, to quote the Americans, the ball is in the court of the Russians to see what responses we get from them, and thus far we have had very, very little, indeed. And that, I think, is an indication that the Russians as ever want to play this carefully and they want to buy some time. So there's been an awful lot of contact between the U.S. and the Russians in recent days, lots of calls between, the national security, Mike Waltz and his Russian counterpart, the CIA director, and his Russian counterpart. We know that Steve Witkoff, the U.S. presidential envoy, is bound for Russia. We're expecting him there fairly soon. So there's been a lot of contact. We know that the Americans have a pretty good idea of where the Russians are on this. Not least because, remember, this whole process began with a conversation between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump that lasted an hour and a half, and there were subsequently those talks between the Russian and the American senior officials in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia about two and a half weeks ago So the Americans have a vague idea of where the Russians are on this, but publicly the Russians at the moment are refusing to say anything. And everybody is basically waiting to see what their response is, and what, if anything, they demand as a concession before they agree to any kind of temporary ceasefire. Because agreeing a ceasefire a temporary one would essentially breach a sort of fundamental Russian negotiating position down the ages, which is this, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so I think the expectation is that even if the Russians indicate some kind of sympathy towards agreeing a short-term ceasefire, there will be an awful lot of strings attached. So do we have an indication of what potentially some of those Russian demands are? Or is that all being done in a closed process? Do we have an inkling of that? Yeah, I mean, look, the Russians have been pretty clear about it. On one level, they've said, look, they are not going to accept any kind of European stroke, NATO reassurance forces in Ukraine, after any kind of ceasefire. They've also made it very clear that they want Ukraine to be very clear about reining on its ambition of joining NATO. I think it's very likely that they will demand the lifting of Western sanctions on Russia before there's any kind of movement by then. I think the interesting question is, do the Russians broaden their demands out from just Ukraine, specific demands, to more their broader security demands? In recent days, Russian ministers and spokesmen and women have been talking a lot about addressing what they call the root causes of the conflict now. That is their code for Russia's belief that it was, and a security encroachment by NATO forces coming closer to Russian territory that provoked them into launching what they call their military operation here in Ukraine. Now, that analysis is dismissed as ludicrous by the West, but the question is, will the Russians say we act on some kind of short-term ceasefire? But we've got to have a discussion about the presence of U.S. forces in parts of Europe, and we got to make sure that NATO steps back from countries like Poland and the Baltic states. So that's the interesting question. Do they broaden their demands out from Ukraine to their broader security issues, James? As always, really good to get your analysis there. James Landell joining us live from Kiev. Thank you very much. A number of different angles and a number of different meetings taking place throughout today when it comes to the geopolitics of this. But just to remind you that line that is coming from the Kremlin, reported by the AFP news agency, that U.S. negotiators are indeed flying to Russia for those talks on Ukraine. The Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Pesov just confirming that negotiators are en route to Russia now and contacts are planned. But no confirmation whether Russia has handed the U.S. a list of demands for Ukraine deal. But arguably, as James was saying there, we know some of the demands that Russia has, and Ukraine joining NATO, absolutely off the list. So yeah, Pesov just saying that U.S. negotiators are en route, and it's true that contacts are planned, but Dmitry Pesov saying, let's not get ahead of ourselves, we'll tell you about them later. Contact has already happened there, was of course that phone call. But conversation between the Mike Waltz, who's the U.S. National Security Advisor, and the Russian Presidential Advisor, Yuri Shakov, certain information has been provided to Russia. So lots of different lines coming out ahead of those talks with the U.S. negotiators in Moscow. Our chief international correspondent, Le Douay, joins us live now. And Elle, as always, it's good to see you on a day where lots of different lines are developing when it comes to our audience. I wonder if you just help us to understand what is the key points that we are looking out for. Because we've got the Polish president said that Poland should have some form of nuclear arms. We've got the G7 summit, of course. We've got the negotiators on their way to the Kremlin. What is your main takeaway of what we are focusing on today? Good morning, Kesha. It's always good to speak with you. And you're right to point out, people are getting overwhelmed by just how much is happening. Flooding the zone is how they describe it in the United States. And of course, we're just focusing on foreign policy. There are broader strategic issues. Some would say even a crisis at play, a reordering of the relationship between the United States and its allies. Some days it seems to be completely shattered. Some days it seems to be possible to rescue in some way. It all depends on what President Trump says and does that day, whether it comes to tariffs or security arrangements. But I think what we have to keep an eye on, because it really is the heart of the issue right now, when it comes to what has always been called the transatlantic partnership, that of course is enshrined in the NATO military alliance. It all depends on what happens in Ukraine. And that confirmation that you just read from Moscow, that a delegation is now on its way to Moscow. You heard also in this program already from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, they want this 30-day ceasefire that was agreed in Jeddah between the Americans and the Ukrainians to be agreed by Russia. But as you yourself have been seeing, Kasha, there's no indication yet exactly what President Putin wants to do. All we've seen from him is this quite unexpected image of President Putin in military fatigues for the first time since the war, perhaps taking a leaf out of President Zelensky's book and appearing in the embattled region of UKK, where it does seem from all reports that the Russians, backed up by North Korean forces, by drones, are pushing the Ukrainians out, which is a real setback for the Ukrainians. If peace talks, well, let's not call them peace talks. If talks of some kind are now on the agenda, and that's absolutely critical because that would have that holding of that Kursk region within Russian territory by Ukraine would have given Ukraine a strengthened hand in any form of negotiations. But really important for you, just to explain there that we're talking about a possible ceasefire with not close to any peace talks yet. It would be good if you just differentiate that for us. Lee, with your expertise, well, viewers may have heard President Trump last night saying he really hopes that now that the Ukrainians have accepted it, that the Russians will now accept it. He said, if we get that agreed, we are 80% there. 80%. They are nowhere near. 80%, possibly 5%, would be an optimistic for the Ukrainians. Well, in the first place. President Putin has always said he doesn't want to cease fire, and a ceasefire is not enough. And especially for Ukraine, a ceasefire is not enough. First of all, how can you have a ceasefire agreed for days? There will be the very difficult negotiations on how the ceasefire is monitored. How is Ukraine protected during this time? What happens if either side violates the ceasefire and the overarching, for you could call it a question. But for Ukraine, it is an existential worry. Ukraine's great deep fear is that for Russia, this is just a tactical pause. A pause as it often happens in war, for would have to be said both sides to regroup, to refresh, to rethink, and then go back to the battlefield. But there has been absolutely no indication of any change at all in President Putin's worldview, which is that he doesn't believe Ukraine is a country, he doesn't believe it has a right to exist. And he basically has never gone back from his saying that he basically wants all of Ukraine. And if he doesn't have it territorially, he wants to have a government in Kyiv, which will bend to his will. Lee, as always, really good to get your clarity and your analysis of the bigger picture of this. Thank you so much, our international correspondent editor, Lee Set there, joining us live. Thank you so much. Numerous different lives, just Dmitry Pesov, Kremlin spokesperson, saying about Zelensky's remarks that Ukraine will not accept the annexation of any territory by Russia, exactly to what Lei was just mentioning there. Dmitry Pesov saying that Crimea, Shestelhan, Zaporodonetsk, and Luhansk are Russian regions. They're in the Russian constitution. It's a fact. So as Lei was saying, we are nowhere near a peace. We are talking about a potential ceasefire, but there's still an awful lot at stake.